I've been working as a warehouse operator for a few years now. It's a straightforward job, but it requires attention and strict adherence to safety rules since we deal with heavy equipment and conditions that can quickly turn dangerous if someone slips up. Everything was fine until I was asked to train a new hire, Mike. He had been brought on through a recommendation from the manager, which usually means the person has something special to offer. But from the start, I knew something was off about him. Mike was tall, in his mid-30s, with an edgy, nervous energy that didn't quite fit the warehouse's rhythm. On his first day, he arrived late but walked in with a grin like he was in complete control of the situation. At first, I tried to be friendly and patient. I explained the safety procedures, how to use the equipment correctly, and the importance of following the rules. But he didn't seem to care. By the second day, he was already refusing to wear the safety helmet, saying it was uncomfortable and that he didn't need it. Then he started handling pallets carelessly, almost knocking over an entire load of expensive products. The worst part was how he began provoking the other employees, mocking how they did their work or questioning why they followed the rules so closely. I was growing increasingly frustrated, but since I was responsible for him, I felt stuck trying to correct his behavior, even though he clearly didn't want to listen. Things started spiraling out of control in the second week. Mike began treating everything like a joke, as if the job was just a stage for him to grab attention. He would mess around with the forklifts, pretending he was going to crash into the shelves, laughing loudly while everyone else tensed up, bracing for disaster. At one point, he stacked heavy boxes precariously on a high shelf, and one of them fell, nearly hitting a coworker who had to dive out of the way. When I confronted him, urging him to take the job seriously, he just shrugged and said, "Relax, Adam. It's just a joke. You're way too serious about this stuff." The breaking point came one night during a graveyard shift. It was a cold evening, and we were restocking products in the warehouse's refrigerated sections. Mike was particularly restless, darting around like he was bored out of his mind. While I was organizing boxes inside the industrial freezer, I felt a shove against my back. I turned around, but before I could fully process what was happening, I heard the heavy door slam shut with a loud clang. The automatic lock engaged, echoing in the freezing chamber. "Good luck in there, boss," Mike shouted from the other side, laughing like he'd just pulled the best prank of his life. I pounded on the door, yelling for him to open it, but he just ignored me and walked away, his muffled laughter fading into the distance. My first reaction was panic. The cold inside that freezer was unbearable, and I knew that staying there too long could have serious consequences. I tried to stay calm and banged on the door with all the strength I had, shouting for help, but the noise was muffled. It seemed like no one was around to hear me. My breath came out in thick clouds, and even with gloves on, my hands started to go numb. I scanned the area, searching for anything I could use to keep warm or signal for help, but the space was cramped, lined with shelves full of products, and there was no emergency exit. All I could think was, how could someone think this is a joke? I don't know how long I was in there, but every minute felt like an eternity. The cold seeped into my bones, and my vision started to blur. Then, finally, I heard distant noises, voices and footsteps echoing through the warehouse. Summoning the last of my strength, I pounded on the door again, this time more desperately, and shouted as loud as I could. The door creaked open, and one of my coworkers, George, appeared with a look of absolute shock on his face. "Adam? Oh my God. What happened?" He pulled me out, and my legs almost gave way beneath me. I managed to mumble Mike's name, explaining what he had done, but George said he'd already disappeared from the warehouse. My fear quickly turned into anger, but the cold left me too shaken to speak. After I was pulled out of the freezer, they brought me to the break room. George wrapped me in a thermal blanket and handed me something warm to drink while another coworker informed the supervisor. I was trembling, partly from the cold and partly from the mix of rage and disbelief. How could someone do something so dangerous and just walk away as if it were nothing? When the manager arrived, the first thing he asked was, "Where's Mike?" No one knew for sure. He had apparently left the warehouse without saying a word, driving off in his car. I explained what had happened in detail, and the manager looked visibly uncomfortable, mumbling something about needing to investigate this thoroughly. The full picture began to emerge the next morning. George, who has always been a bit of a sleuth, decided to dig into Mike's background. He managed to get information from former coworkers at other companies and discovered that Mike had been fired multiple times for irresponsible behavior. The most disturbing part was learning about his history of pranks that had caused harm to others, ranging from minor incidents to more serious ones. In one case, he had nearly injured a coworker by disabling a safety mechanism, and in another, he'd been caught tampering with confidential company data. There were even rumors that he had a criminal record, though the details were unclear. I felt torn between relief that I was okay and anger that someone like him had managed to slip through the cracks. As the days passed, my anger turned into frustration. The manager assured me that he'd reported the incident to HR and that the appropriate measures would be taken. But to be honest, he seemed more concerned about protecting the company's image than addressing what had happened. Mike remained missing, and a growing sense of vulnerability lingered. I kept wondering, what if he comes back? What if he tries something worse with someone else? Yet, the company seemed content with the fact that he had disappeared and showed little interest in pursuing the matter further. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I contacted a lawyer and explained the entire situation. He advised me to file a police report, especially given the risk Mike's actions posed to my safety. George volunteered to come with me as a witness, and we went to the police station where I recounted every detail. While I was there, one of the officers mentioned that Mike's name was already in their system for prior incidents. That confirmed what we had suspected all along. He wasn't just irresponsible. He was someone who couldn't distinguish between a prank and a crime. Filing the report gave me some sense of control and reassurance that steps were being taken to prevent Mike from harming anyone else. The police assured me they would try to locate him, and even though I knew it might take time, just having the incident officially documented brought some relief. At work, the atmosphere was tense for a while. My coworkers were visibly more cautious, and the manager started reinforcing hiring procedures, as if trying to prove everything was under control. But for me, the scars ran deeper than they appeared. Even now, every time I step into a freezer or any confined space, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. I've learned to be more vocal about setting boundaries, both at work and in my personal life. This experience taught me that you can't ignore red flags, even if it feels like you're overreacting. As for Mike, I never found out exactly what happened to him. I heard rumors that he was arrested for another incident, but nothing was confirmed. The only certainty I have is that I never want to go through anything like that again. It wasn't just the cold that left a mark that day. It was the realization that trust can be dangerous, especially when dealing with someone like him.
I've been working as a night caregiver at a nursing home for a few years. It's not an easy job, but I've always appreciated the peaceful atmosphere during the night shifts. Most of the residents go to bed early, and my role is mainly to do rounds, ensure everyone is comfortable, and assist if anyone needs help. I've grown very attached to the elderly residents. Many don't get frequent visitors, so I enjoy spending time with them, listening to their stories or just chatting. The nights can be lonely, but I never minded until Greg showed up. Greg was hired to help with the night shift, which seemed like a great idea at first, since taking care of 10 residents alone could be exhausting. He was tall with an easy smile and an overly friendly demeanor from day one. He asked a lot of questions about the job, the residents, and even how the rooms were arranged. At first, I thought he was just eager to learn quickly, but I soon noticed something odd about the way he observed everything. He seemed more interested in the residents' personal belongings than in their care. During rounds, he often lingered in rooms for too long, touching things he didn't need to. Once, I asked if he needed help, and he laughed, saying, "Just familiarizing myself with the place." It made me uneasy, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. As the weeks went by, Greg's behavior grew stranger. He made comments that felt inappropriate for the job, like asking about the value of certain items residents kept in their rooms. One night, he even asked about a ring worn by Mr. Arthur, an antique wedding band that was clearly valuable. "Do you think he still wears it because it's sentimental or just out of habit?" he asked with a smile that sent chills down my spine. I tried to brush off my discomfort and change the subject, but I began keeping a closer eye on Greg. Whenever he entered a room, I found myself waiting for him to come out, hoping he wouldn't take too long. Everything changed on a particularly quiet night. I was in the main hallway reviewing reports when I heard a faint noise coming from Mr. Arthur's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I saw Greg bent over the resident's bed, his hand on Mr. Arthur's finger, trying to remove the ring. My heart raced. "Greg, what are you doing?" My voice came out louder than I intended, and he quickly turned around, looking like a child caught stealing cookies. I was just adjusting his position," he stammered, clearly nervous. But Mr. Arthur was sound asleep, and his excuse made no sense. My stomach churned, and at that moment I knew something was very wrong. Greg tried to explain himself, but the discomfort in the air was tangible. He looked uncomfortable. "You know, I was just trying to help him sleep better," he said with a nervous smile. I didn't respond, just stared at him for a few moments before saying, "Let's talk outside." My tone was firm, but inside I was on high alert. I didn't want to confront him directly without proof, but I needed a plan. He left the room, straightening up as if nothing had happened, and we walked back to the common area where our workstation was located. The silence between us was heavy, and all I could think about was how to report this without causing unnecessary panic. That same night, I took advantage of a moment when Greg stepped out into the hallway to quickly review previous shift reports. That's when I started noticing a pattern. Small but valuable items had gone missing from residents' rooms on nights Greg was working. A watch belonging to Mr. Ernest, an antique brooch owned by Mrs. Clara, items that had previously been written off as misplaced. My mind began racing, connecting the dots. I immediately called the nursing home supervisor, explaining what had happened. She advised me to keep an eye on Greg and promised to contact the police in the morning. Little did I know, Greg wouldn't wait that long. A few hours later, near the end of the shift, I noticed Greg acting restless. He kept checking his watch and leaving the workstation more often than usual. With only a short time left before the shift change, he announced that he needed to leave early because of an important appointment. My heart pounded. I knew that if I let him leave, I might never see him again, and the authorities might not be able to track him down. Trying to stay calm, I asked him to wait just a few more minutes, pretending I needed his help with a final task. He gave me a suspicious look, but reluctantly agreed, though it was clear he was growing impatient. In the meantime, I quickly texted the supervisor, informing her that Greg was trying to leave early and that something needed to be done immediately. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. As I attempted to distract Greg with small talk, I heard the sound of quick footsteps coming down the hallway. It was the supervisor, accompanied by 2 police officers. The moment Greg saw them, his face went pale. "This must be some kind of mistake," he began, but before he could say more, he turned and bolted toward the emergency exit. The officers chased after him, but unfortunately, he managed to escape before they could detain him. However, they found enough evidence in his locker on site. A bag containing several of the residents' belongings, some already tagged for pawn shops. After the police recovered the stolen items from Greg's locker, the atmosphere in the nursing home became tense. The residents who had lost their belongings were outraged, especially when they learned he had gotten away. The supervisor apologized to everyone, promising to implement stricter hiring processes and increase security measures. Despite this, I couldn't shake the image of catching Greg in Mr. Arthur's room. His fake smile, his nervousness. How could someone be so calculating, especially in a place meant to provide safety and care? The following days were filled with police reports and attempts to track down Greg, but he seemed to have vanished completely. The stolen jewelry and other items were returned to the residents, but the emotional damage was harder to repair. As for me, I've become more vigilant than ever. I can't help but feel a twinge of distrust whenever someone new joins the staff. What scares me most is knowing that Greg could be doing the same thing somewhere else, deceiving other people. This experience changed me, but it also reinforced something I've always believed. Caring for others goes beyond just following rules. You have to stay alert, even in places that seem safe.
I've been working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized company for a few years. The environment is usually calm, with everyone focused on their tasks, but there's always been a basic camaraderie among the departments. That's how I met Mark, the IT specialist. He was the go-to guy whenever anyone needed help with their computers, and I was no exception. One day, during the monthly report crunch, I lost an essential file due to a system failure. I was panicking and Mark came to the rescue. In less than 10 minutes, he recovered everything. From that moment, we became friends. He was laid back, quick with jokes, and seemed like a trustworthy guy. Over time, I started to notice that Mark had a peculiar way of interacting with people. He often joked in ways that crossed a line, like remotely accessing someone's computer screen during a meeting and saying, "See how much you guys trust me." Everyone laughed, but something about it made me uncomfortable. It felt invasive, even though he genuinely seemed to think it was all in good fun. With me, it started harmlessly. He'd comment on files on my computer that I didn't even know he had seen. "You still use spreadsheets like that?" Or, "That's an ugly report, James. Let's modernize it." I'd respond with an awkward smile, but a part of me started feeling uneasy. Things began to get stranger when my phone started acting up. At first, notifications disappeared before I could read them. Then I noticed messages that seemed to have been marked as read even though I hadn't opened them. I thought it might be a virus or a system glitch, but the more it happened, the more paranoid I became. One day, while we were having coffee at the office, Mark made a comment that made my blood run cold. "That message you sent yesterday, James? Bold move." He laughed, but his smile felt more calculated than playful. The problem was, I hadn't mentioned anything to him about any message. I tried to confront him casually. "What message? What are you talking about?" I asked, feigning curiosity. He laughed again and brushed it off. "Oh, nothing, just joking." But my suspicion grew. I started monitoring my phone more closely and noticed that it seemed to be accessed remotely. Even apps I rarely used appeared in my recent activity. That's when I decided to investigate further. I ran a quick check on my computer and, to my shock, found files that shouldn't have been there. They had been accessed from an IP address that, after some digging, I traced directly back to Mark's network. The discovery sent me into a panic. Mark wasn't just snooping through my files. He seemed to have full access to my phone and possibly other personal data. That night, I stayed up late trying to figure out how far it had gone. I combed through my email history, messages, even bank transactions, looking for signs of tampering. Thankfully, there was no indication he had touched my finances, but finding my files on his system was proof enough that he was monitoring things he had no business seeing. The next day, I went to work determined to confront him, but I knew I had to be careful. I waited until we were alone in the break room and said, "Mark, I need to know why you're accessing my personal devices." He feigned surprise. "What are you talking about, James? You're imagining things." But his tone wasn't convincing. When I mentioned tracing the IP back to his network, the fake smile he always wore disappeared. "Look, it's not what you think," he began, trying to sound innocent. "I was just trying to help you be more efficient, you know? Sometimes you take too long on simple things." It was unbelievable. He genuinely thought he could justify his actions as helping. My patience snapped. "Helping? You invaded my privacy, Mark. This has nothing to do with work." He tried to backpedal, raising his hands as if to defuse the situation. "Okay, maybe I went a little overboard, but I didn't mean any harm," he said, wearing that insincere expression of someone who knows they're in the wrong but wants to downplay it. I didn't buy a word of it. Without warning, I went straight to HR and reported everything, from the strange comments to the unauthorized access to my devices. They were alarmed and promised to investigate immediately. That same day, the company's security team began checking the systems. The investigation uncovered something far worse than I'd imagined. Mark wasn't just snooping on me. He had used his IT privileges to access personal files and data from several other employees. Some hadn't noticed anything, but others reported odd behavior, like missing files or altered messages. It was as if Pandora's box had been opened. The company suspended Mark on the spot and contacted the police to launch a full investigation. However, Mark didn't show up to work the next day, and no one could locate him. The situation spiraled into something I never could have foreseen. The police confirmed that Mark had a history of similar incidents at previous companies, but he always left before any legal action could be taken. The most disturbing part was learning that he wasn't just snooping for fun. He used the information he found to manipulate his colleagues, just as he had tried to do with me, coercing favors and exploiting their vulnerabilities. Some coworkers admitted they had been blackmailed by him but were too scared to report it. The company, embarrassed by the security breach, conducted a full audit and implemented strict new policies to protect employees and their data. For me, the experience left lasting scars. I spent weeks feeling paranoid, double-checking every account and device to ensure he hadn't left any traces. But I also learned to never ignore the small red flags of inappropriate behavior, especially in a professional environment. To this day, I'm cautious about sharing unnecessary information at work and keep my passwords and devices tightly secured. As for Mark, I never heard from him again. The police believe he fled to another state, but no one knows for sure. What I do know is that if I had ignored my instincts, the damage he could have caused would have been far greater, for me and for others.